Good morning, wherever you are. I am Jonathan Sarna. Um, I'm director of the Schusterman Center for Israel Studies, and it's really my pleasure to welcome you to the second semester of our Schusterman scholarly seminars, and we certainly could not kick off this second semester any better than with our speaker today. Professor Miriam Udel is Associate Professor of German Studies and Jewish Studies at Emory University. Really, her work focuses on Yiddish language, literature, and culture. She trained at Harvard. She was actually ordained by Yeshivat Maharat. She's published a book called Never Better, The Modern Jewish Picaresque, which immediately won the National Jewish Book Award. And most recently, and likewise relevant to our presentation today, she has recently published a book called Honey on the Page, a treasury of Yiddish children's literature, which has appeared from New York University Press. And she's now working, and we're going to hear some of that, on a larger interpretation of children's literature and how it can really be a microscope for understanding the modern Jewish experience in Ashkenaz. A few housekeeping notes. Uh, First of all, I'm going to ask everybody to please mute your microphones. Second of all, you may see a transcript on the bottom of your screen. If you like it, keep it. If you don't, just press on live transcript on the bottom right of your screen and you can make it disappear. Should you have questions as Professor Udel proceeds, please put them in the chat. Um, and my colleague, Dr. Shana Weiss, will be handling those questions. We will certainly leave time for them. But now, without further ado, let me introduce Professor Miriam Udel.
Thank you so much, Professor Sarna, for the warm introduction, and also to Dr. Shana Weiss, my long ago student around the turn of the millennium, who is now a treasured colleague, and to all of the people behind the scenes at Brandeis who have made this such a smooth process, even with all of the technical challenges and the challenges of distance that arise. So today I'm going to be talking about carved sticks and honeystones, Zionism in Yiddish children's literature after the Holocaust. I could have also called this talk, We May Have Sinned Against Child Psychology, and I'll explain why in a few minutes. So when we think about children's literature broadly, many times we think about the stories of the brothers Grimm, collected by Jacob and Wilhelm Grimm starting in 1812 and going through 7 editions, the last one appearing in 1857. And the irony here is that the Grimms did not set out to write stories for children. They set out to collect the stories of the folk, what would eventually become the German folk. And they were devoted ethnographers who realized around the 2nd edition that they also had a potential commodity that could be sold to families with young children if they would just massage the content a little bit to make it more suitable for young readers. And their idea of increasing the suitability of the stories was to play down any sort of sexual activity, particularly if it happened outside of holy matrimony, and to punch up and enhance the violence of the tales. So that is indeed what they did between 1812 and 1857. And the reason that I mentioned the Brothers Grimm is that every children's literature is stamped by its originary moment. And the Grimm's tales are very clearly stamped by the desire to bring about a German cultural nationalism and an awareness of German cultural nationalism. And in a somewhat parallel way, Yiddish children's literature, which really develops in the first decades of the 20th century, particularly in the teens, the 20s, and the 30s, also reflects a concern with Yiddish cultural nationalism that gets inflected in many ways that we're going to talk about. And at the same time, the other way that it is stamped by its originary moment is that it coincides with a growing awareness of child psychology and childhood as a discrete developmental phase of life, what the French theorist Philippe Ariès would come to refer to as the invention of childhood. So the children's literature that was produced by the Yiddish left is a historically bounded phenomenon. It begins at a certain time and it sort of trickles to an end at a certain time. So as I mentioned, the time when it begins is really the turn of the 20th century. Now, it doesn't start as a project of writing new stories for children. It starts as a project of taking existing stories that had child protagonists or were somehow about childhood and retrofitting those stories for younger readers. So one of the most successful children's writers before there was such a thing was Sholem Aleichem. And it was easy to take a holiday tale by Sholem Aleichem, to cut out all of the boring parts where he railed against economic inequality and injustice, to slap on a glossary of difficult to read words, or to bowdlerize the text and simplify those words, and to call it a children's story. And that started happening in 1900, 1902, 1903. But about a decade later, other authors, lesser known authors, had actually begun to write for a young audience. And the reason that that happened, and the reason that a publishing structure took shape, is because of the secular Jewish school systems that were allied with various Jewish political movements on the left. So the political vision of Zionists, of Bundist socialists, of communists, of just plain Yiddishists who believe that the most important thing for Ashkenazi Jewish modernity is to consolidate knowledge of Yiddish. All of these different ideologies give rise to political parties, which in turn open networks of schools, both in Europe and in the Americas, and in some other places as well, but those were the largest school systems. So taking just the example of New York, by 1926, 4 separate Yiddish school systems were operating in New York City. And they included the Sholem Aleichem schools, which were the just Yiddish schools, as well as the socialist Bundist schools, the labor Zionist schools of the Verband, and eventually the communist schools of the International Workers' Order, known as Ordenschulen, or order schools. So today I want to focus on the labor Zionist schools because we're going to be talking about literature having to do with Israel and Zionism, particularly that gets published after the Holocaust. Now, for a moment, I just want to take us through some of the key events of the pre-war years. And I want to explain that all of these movements of the Jewish left, from the standpoint of today, look somewhat similar. But one of the places where the differing political visions are really discernible in terms of school curricula has to do with language instruction, particularly at the elementary level. So the fault line between the Poalei Zion, the Zionists, and the socialist territorialists in the sense that they wanted the Jews to flourish in whatever territory or land they happened to be in the diaspora. The fall line between them really came with respect to teaching Hebrew at the elementary level. So the socialist territorialists wanted to preserve the centrality of Yiddish and introduce Hebrew only later, as Naomi Prower-Kadar writes in her study, her wonderful study of these American Yiddish school systems. And by the way, it's called Raising Secular Jews, Yiddish Schools, and their periodicals for American children. And it was published by Brandeis, which is part of why I'm mentioning it so prominently to this audience. Poalei Zion and the Farban schools wanted both Hebrew and Yiddish to be taught in a bilingual program from the very beginning. A second fault line had to do with the balance of socialist and Jewish curricular content. Nobody on the left wanted to teach Jewish prayer or ritual as such, but the Poalei Zion contingent believed, as Kadar writes, in devoting more time to the teaching of traditional Jewish subjects and texts. They viewed religion as the historical and cultural wellspring from which Jewish ethical and spiritual values were derived. And so the curriculum in the Zionist schools included Jewish history, Jewish literature, Hebrew literature, the Bible approached as a wellspring of Jewish culture, as well as some exposure to Talmudic and rabbinic literature, especially as kids got older, Jewish folklore, and the history of the Jewish religion, all treated as cultural history. Now, I want to flag a couple of broad trends. Jewish nationalism, the sense of a robust Jewish nationalism, was muted somewhat after the Bolshevik Revolution, say until 1924. There was a great deal of respect for the USSR across the Jewish left, whether it was more open admiration in the case of the communists or more grudging in the case of the Bundists, because Yiddish was recognized and funded in certainly the first decade and a half of the Soviet experiment. The goal was to make the Jewish child a knowing Jew in the Farban schools rather than a believing Jew by creating an environment that was totally and positively Jewish, espousing national, cultural, and ethical ideals based on Yiddish and Hebrew literature, Jewish history, and Jewish folklore. But from the mid-1930s on, as a result of the rise of Nazism, all of the Yiddish secular schools intensified their Jewish character, their distinctively Jewish character. And during World War II in the United States, where Yiddish education continued uninterrupted, the Farban continued to nurture a sense of obligation in its students toward the diaspora as well as toward the land of Israel, as Kadar writes. There was a strong ethos in the Farban schools, in the Zionist schools, of Klal Yisrael, the collectivity of Israel and of the Jewish people. After the war, increasingly Jewish ritual events were introduced, such as the bar and bas mitzvah. Talmud study was amplified after the war, and so was the allegiance to the land of Israel. As you might imagine, the trends toward augmenting Jewish content went into overdrive after the Holocaust, and the thrust of Yiddish children's literature really shifted to cultural consolidation and preservation. One of the interesting places where we get information about what the cultural figures who were leading these school systems were actually thinking and planning is through the pedagogical journals that they founded alongside periodicals aimed at children. Udel Mark was an absolutely central figure. He was a grammarian, he was a novelist, he was one of the founders of YIVO, he was an educator in the Jewish schools, and he was also a prolific contributor to and editor of some of these pedagogical journals. And he started one called Der Pedagogische Bulletin, the Pedagogical Bulletin, in 1941 as a forum for the teachers in the various Yiddish secular schools. And in a 1943 editorial, he opined that children, quote, should not be sheltered from the brutality of the suffering experienced by their fellow Jews, but that they also needed tales of Jewish resistance and heroism to counterbalance narratives of tragedy and to bolster the young reader. So it was really from that the Yiddish schools took their cue, and the Yiddish schools in America incorporated Holocaust education into their curricula, as Kadar says, almost as soon as the events transpired. Other Jewish schooling, particularly taking place in English, only really started to develop Holocaust education in the 1960s, according to Kadar. Udel Mark wrote, "The children of the Yiddish school may be said to have lived through the happenings themselves." And he's talking about American Yiddish-speaking school children here. For them, the gruesome tortures, the march through the crematories and the gas chambers did not remain a secret. The teachers never stopped telling the children what happened to their cousins in Europe. They recited poems by poets who perished or were saved by a miracle. They read accounts telling how people were saved from certain death. It may be that we sinned thereby against child psychology. Nevertheless, we permitted ourselves to be influenced by the urge to take our children in as partners in our harsh fate, and to arm them with firmness and to brighten their spirits with the luster of the recent martyrdom of fellow Jews. So that's something that Udel Mark wrote in an essay called Changes in the Yiddish School. So now I want to move from questions of history and that sort of broad understanding of these trends in pre-war and then post-Holocaust education and presentation of the events for children. I want to move from history to my own specialty of aesthetic representation. And I want to note the complex layering of historical events that pertained to the Jewish experience with events in the development of childhood and child psychology, together with artistic questions, questions of literary representation that find themselves in a dynamic relationship to the historical events. So the kind of literary question that I'm talking about is the continuum that we see in Yiddish children's literature from mimetic to non-mimetic representation of historical events, meaning is it realistic or is it other than realistic, which might mean supernatural, it might mean dreamlike and stylized. There are a lot of ways to not be realistic, but that's a continuum from mimesis to its various alternatives, and also the continuum from literature that was explicitly politically engaged to stories and poems that were only subtly politically engaged or pointing implicitly in a certain political direction. So in the late 1930s to the late 1940s, really that whole decade, one of the periodicals for children, the Kinderjournal of the Sholem Aleichem Folk Institute, which was really the just Yiddish arm of the left, de-emphasized fantasy with its supernatural trappings in favor of realistic fiction that adopts as its focal point the two momentous events of the period, the Holocaust and the establishment of the State of Israel. And so today, I want to sort of take a cue from that and put behind you, put before you, two kinds of hero. Let me just take a drink here. Scratch what I just said. Not that I want to put them before you, but that this literature in the Yiddish periodicals manifested two kinds of hero. One was the survivor of the European catastrophe in the realistic mode, and the other was the defender of the Yishuv, of the nascent settlement in pre-state Israel, also in the realistic mode. But what I want to put before you now is two stories that really take us across the ends of this continuum from the mimetic, realistic, to the more fantastical, somewhat supernatural. So the first story that I'm going to talk about, and now I'm going to try to share my screen from here, and if it doesn't go well, we have backup ready. Okay, well, I'm trying to get our faces in the right place so that it allows me to advance and you to see the slide. So the first story is a novella by Tzina Rabinovich. One of my hopes with Honey on the Page, the book that I released in October, is that Tzina Rabinovich will become a little bit more of a household name, which I think she really deserves to be. The longest single piece that I include in Honey on the Page is this novella, Amaisa Mita Shtekele, The Story of a Stick. And Tzina Rabinovich is an incredibly skilled storyteller. She was born in Bessarabia in 1895, and she benefited from an unusually sophisticated education that culminated in her attending university in Moscow. She identified very early on as a Zionist, and she kind of invented the Shana Aleph, the year abroad around college age, by spending 1913, 1914 living in Palestine. She spent the Great War years in Russia, but then she returned to the land of Israel thereafter. She moved to New York in 1921, working as a Hebrew teacher and traveling very frequently. She began to publish in Hebrew in 1918, so when she was 23, and continued to write in Yiddish, penning poems, stories, novels, and novellas for children, as well as reportage for adults. She had been translated into Spanish and published widely in Latin America. She settled in Israel in 1961, and she died in Tel Aviv in 1965. And The Story of a Stick was originally published, as you see here, by the Yiddish schools in Mexico in 1958. It was translated into Hebrew as Maaseh B'Makel in 1960. And even the Hebrew version was not published in Israel. It was published in New York by the Board of Jewish Education, which I find to be a fascinating detail in terms of, just who was publishing Yiddish children's literature and the fact that it really wasn't happening in the land of Israel, even in 1960. So now I want to tell you a little bit about the story itself. As I mentioned, it is a novella. It's about 60 pages long. So I will try to do this not too exhaustively. The Story begins with a character living in Frankfurt named Jakob Gutmann, whose wife becomes very ill with a difficult to diagnose disease. And Gutmann is a very prosperous merchant and a Yid von a ganz Jod, really a formidable Jew of the old stamp that it's hard to find today. He's very charitable, and his approach to trying to assist in his wife's healing is to distribute a lot of alms, both to individuals and to institutions. And with his wife's encouragement, he decides to travel to Eretz Israel, to Palestine in the year 1858, in order to distribute charity in person in the Holy Land and hope that that will hasten his wife's recovery. While he is in Israel, a scribe who is hoping to sell a Torah scroll to Gutmann comes to see him in his hotel room and invites him to come and check out his family cottage industry of the father and his 10 sons who sit all day writing out Torah scrolls. Gutmann does so. He purchases the scroll, and the youngest son of the scribe decides that he wants to give some sort of a gift to the traveler that will induce him to give the boy a few coins so that he can have something of his own. He's a little bit sneaky about how he decides to do this and to elicit the gift. He's thinking about what he, a poor child, can possibly give, and he is absent-mindedly whittling a branch from an olive tree when he realizes that he could carve a pasuk, a biblical verse, into the stick, and that would be a suitable gift for the visitor. So he carves in the verse, Ki tavo el haaretz, when you come into the land and you shall plant. Now, in rabbinic midrash and classical Jewish midrash, this is already a verse that comes in for tendentious, strong reading. In its original context, the verse says that when you come into the land and you plant fruit trees, you need to wait a certain length of time before you can enjoy the fruit. But the rabbis reread the verse very strongly to say that when you come into the land, you shall plant. In other words, that there is a freestanding obligation to come into the land and to plant fruit trees. And so the plot of this novella is set in motion by this kind of selfishly motivated transactional gift that the boy prepares for the visitor. It's not entirely altruistic, just as Gutmann's journey is not entirely altruistic because he's hoping for something to happen metaphysically by virtue of his trip to Israel, and he's hoping to get something in exchange for his generosity. He makes the return journey to Frankfurt with the Torah scroll and the carved stick, and lo and behold, when he returns, there's a party going on at his house, and there's a woman in a beautiful blue dress, and it turns out to be his wife who has recently healed and is entirely unrecognizably recovered from her illness. They have a very happy life together until several years later, their son, Joseph Gutmann, is conscripted to serve in the German army in the Franco-German or Franco-Prussian War of 1870. And they don't want him to go because he's an only son. But as the rabbi lectures the father, Jacob Gutmann, serving in the army is the price of citizenship. And if the Jews are going to be gifted with full citizenship in the German nation, serve they must. And so they caution their son, take this stick with you. It will help you to survive. And the young man does with a lot of reluctance. And sure enough, at one point in the fighting, he falls into a deep chasm, and he is able to climb, and he's injured, and he's able to climb out only by stabilizing himself with his rifle in one hand and the carved stick in the other. And he climbs out of the chasm to safety, and he survives the rest of the war. After the war, he seeks out the rabbi in Alsace and offers to give charity, as his parents have instructed him to do. He befriends the rabbi and his family, and as you might imagine, he ends up marrying the rabbi's daughter and settling in Alsace, where together they form a family and they have a son named Benjamin. Now, Benjamin Gutmann has a happy enough childhood until he is conscripted to fight in World War I. And after a lot of anxiety about whether he should fight for his father's land, the Germans, or his mother's land, the French, he decides to fight for the French. And he also has wartime adventures wherein the stick, the carved stick, saves his life. The first time he is running and this away from the Germans, and the stick is preventing him from moving freely. So he takes it out of his coat and he keeps on running, but then the stick trips him. And when the Germans see him go down, they assume that they have successfully shot him and that they shouldn't waste any more bullets on somebody who's probably a corpse by now. So they stop shooting and he's able to lie down until the battle is over. And then later he is under attack again, and he is found unconscious by German soldiers with the carved stick by his side, and he is brought to the hospital to be tended only because they have seen the carved stick and assumed that the carvings are some kind of a code and that he must be an important spy. Now, the doctor who tends to him in the German hospital turns out to be a highly assimilated Jew from Warsaw who befriends the young lieutenant as he heals from his injuries. And they visit after the war in the doctor's hometown of Warsaw. And indeed, Benjamin Gutmann, who is now the father or the adult, he marries the daughter's doctor and they live together in Warsaw after World War I. Unfortunately, their union is not a peaceful one because they have a lot of conflict over the education of the boy and the Jewish identity of the boy. Not on the eve of, on the day of the Anschluss, the father drugs his 13-year-old son, Stefik, so that he can sneak him onto a kinder transport and save his life. And it's Stefik that manages to survive the war. He loses his parents, but he keeps hold of the stick that his father has planted on his person. And he makes it to an orphanage, first in Europe, and then he is sent to Eretz Israel, to immediately pre-state Palestine. And he is able to survive there with the stick as a token of the family that he comes from. And after the war, he is finally ready to bury the stick, as his father has instructed him to do, in the Holy Land of Israel. And so the stick is the symbol. It is a symbol of regeneration, symbolic regeneration. The story manages to incorporate nearly every major Zionist trope. And there's a lot more to say about it, but I'm going to just quickly mention the other story at the end of the other end of the continuum of non-mimetic symbolic representation. So now we move on to something dreamier that can also do double duty as a metonym for the project of Yiddish children's literature in general. So we can discern the concentrated essence of Haskalah messaging for children in one mid-century Zionist text. And it's part of just a single book's worth of stories that were written in Yiddish by the pioneering and prolific Hebrew children's writer, Levi Kipnis. Kipnis was born in the Pale of Settlement in 1894 into a family of 12, and he emigrated to Palestine in 1913 and made a career for himself as an educator. In 1961, he published Unter den Titelbaum, Under the Date Palm, a volume of Yiddish holiday stories in New York with the children's house Farlag Matones, the Gifts Press. And this book was indeed conceived as a gift from one of the foremost children's authors in a renascent Zion to the Yiddish-speaking children of the diaspora, who shared a set of socialist cultural aspirations with their Israeli coevals, and who might be persuaded with honey rather than with vinegar to share in their Zionism as well. Over the course of a lifetime that spanned almost the entire 20th century, Kipnis would go on to contribute about 800 stories and 600 poems to the burgeoning canon of Israeli juvenile literature, and to be numbered among its most fondly remembered founders. Now, one of the stories in that volume is a Passover tale, and it builds on a Midrashic motif that is mentioned in the Talmud, in Tractate Sota 11b, which is a suite of extravagant rabbinic midrashim about the early life of Moses and the supporting characters like Miriam and their parents. And the substance of the midrash describes how the Jewish baby boys who were sentenced by Pharaoh to be thrown into the Nile were placed by their mothers into holes in the ground, dug out in a field in Goshen, the area of Egypt where the Jews were concentrated. And that these holes were under apple trees, and the apple trees would take care of the illegal baby boys. And according to the account in Sota, God would send an angel to clean the newborns and to bestow upon each child 2 suckling stones, one that flowed with oil and the other with honey. And Kipnis takes the story and he expands upon it in the following way. He says, the apple trees cared for the tiny little boys, the blades of grass kept them hidden, and bright-eyed angels with clear wings flew down from the heavens, an angel for each and every child. They stroked the little children's heads so that their hair grew very long, soft, and silky, and covered their whole bodies. They gave every child a pebble in each hand, one a milkstone and the other a honeystone. After that, they dug out holes near the roots of the apple tree and padded them with grass, as a mother makes a bed for her child. They laid the children in the holes as a mother lays her child in the cradle, and they sang heartfelt songs as a mother lulls her child to sleep. So the children survive in these cradle holes with the help of the angels until they form a very literal Kindergarten, a garden of children. And they remain among the tall grasses, waiting for the liberator to come, waiting for the sun to shine more brightly. And on that day, when the sun is able to shine more brightly for these Jewish children, because the Egyptians are plagued with choshech, with darkness, and so the sun is entirely reserved for the Jews and for these little Jewish boys on that day, the liberation begins. So in the classical Midrash, the newly freed Israelites are able to proclaim, "This is my God and I will glorify him." And that is to say that they are able to visually recognize God from the original divine revelation that these little boys had during their infancy. And they can claim with plausible authority, "This is my God, Ze Eli." Meanwhile, in Kipnis's secularizing retelling of the story, the human leader, Moses, takes center stage, and the story crests with a more humanistic appeal to a generation that has been miraculously spared a disabling servile consciousness, even while growing up in a time of slavery. And I quote from my translation, "So the sun illuminated the field, beams of light flooded it, and the children bathed in light. They got up, found their footing, and began to grow bigger and taller, and just like that, they had become young men, tall and handsome as date palms, strong and brave. a large army of heroes standing at the ready and waiting for their liberator. And the rescuer came. It happened at midnight. Moses the liberator came and called, "Stand up, free children, you who were never slaves to Pharaoh, you who never felt his heavy hand, you who never molded any bricks and mortar, stand up and lead the way for the entire people." Now, retrieving the idea of cultivation suggested by the Kindergarten, the garden of children, Kipnis's text manages to straddle the centuries between the biblical Exodus and the modern Haskalah and its aftermath, culminating in the triumphant Exodus to the land of Israel. Reading beyond the story's plain meaning in connection with the Passover liberation tale, Children of the Field offers an allegory for the cultivation of new post-Enlightenment Jews whose destiny is Zion. And if we don't specify Zion as the destination in the narrow sense, this story may also be read as a concentrated synecdoche for the larger project of Yiddish children's literature itself that flourished during the first half of the 20th century. Just as Kipnis's Moses eventually comes to redeem a generation that has grown up bucolically in the fields and never known the overseer's lash, so too Yiddish authors began writing in the early decades of the 20th century for a generation of Jews that wasn't supposed to have ever known the enslavements that dogged earlier Jewish life, whether these were imagined as religious superstition or anti-Semitic violence. In this allegorical reading, it is the educators and authors of books for Jewish children who serve as the liberators and redeemers of a new society of free men and women. Their vision would subtly reshape young Jews' relationship with the past and their purchase on the future. The sustaining milk, honey, and oil were to be the stories themselves. And the situation of the Jewish child suckling on this literature was figured as a kind of protected, womb-like set-off space, a space safe enough to apprehend honestly the cruelty of the world beyond and to imagine remaking that world anew. And that's where I'll conclude the remarks. And just because I got concerned about time, I stopped sharing some of the images, but I am going to just retrieve them now. The illustrator for Honey on the Page, Paula Cohen, contributed this really beautiful rendition of the young boy, whose name we never learn in the story, carving the stone initially in a Jerusalem that is heavily populated by cats, as it still is. This is the cover page for Kipnis's story, Unter den Titelbäumen, and I just love the lettering by Isa, the illustrator, so much that I included it here. And this is Isa's original illustration, which we were also able to reprint in Honey on the Page for that story about the children of the field. And this, of course, is the cover of the book, which I hope you will take a look at. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This was so enjoyable. And I have a lot of questions. Please continue to send them in via the chat, and I will try and get to as many as possible. My first question is about definitions. I spent the time trying to remember that quote I learned sometime in graduate school, that a Zionist is just a territorialist with a visa, right? That, you know, we think of these really defined camps in Jewish nationalism, that you have the territorialists who are here, you have the Zionists who are here, and, you know, never the twain shall meet. And you can add in Bundists and autonomists and whatnot. So when you were thinking about this literature, you know, how did you decide about definitions? How did you decide, you know, what was Zionist in these books? What was traditional attachment to the land of Israel, etc.?
That's a great question. You're absolutely right, Dr. Weiss, that these categories are imposed ex post facto, and there was so much more fluidity in the lived experience of the Jews of the time and even the people who were creating culture for the Jews of the time. Now, we do have the kind of 2020 hindsight, or maybe not quite 2020, where we're able to say, okay, in the context of, let's take the example of Levi Kipnis, in the context of his life and his output, it's really quite striking that he wrote 800 stories in Hebrew and 600 poems in Hebrew. And in 1961, he published one holiday-themed volume in Yiddish in New York for the Yiddish-speaking children of the diaspora. And so I feel pretty confident, with all of that in hindsight, saying he was really a Zionist. That is where the thrust of his work pointed and where the preponderance of his energy and his efforts lay. And the Yiddish for him was more of an instrumental afterthought to try to take his Zionist message to a set of children that he might not ordinarily be able to reach. But it's not always that clear cut. So I think that some of the decision is looking at the corpus of a given author's work, looking also at the trajectory of a given author's life. So many of the writers whose work I included and about whom I wrote biographical notes, their lives were really marked by so much geographical mobility. And some of it was involuntary, trying to stay, a step ahead of persecution. And some of it was more willed. And that's also something that, helps us to say after the fact, this person had a really strong commitment to Zionism, or this person was more of a diasporist, broadly speaking. So it remains as a kind of, it's better as a question than as an answer.
Great. My next question is about just the process of writing this book, right? Like, how did you come to writing this book? It's not, sort of a traditional scholarly monograph. What was the process like? What was translating like? I can sort of go on and on. Even, you mentioned sometimes there wasn't biographical information available about these authors. Could you just speak a little bit about that?
I would love to. So I started working on what became this book in 2013. I was teaching Yiddish language classes almost annually at that point. And I reflected on my own education in Spanish and Hebrew, both of which I studied very intensively before Yiddish. I studied Arabic a little bit before I took up Yiddish. And I realized that in all of those language learning experiences, I had read some kind of children's literature, and that had never been part of my Yiddish education. And I wondered very, very naively, is there any Yiddish children's literature? And is that something that I could share with my students? And oh, by the way, is that something that I would be interested in sharing with my own children? And it very quickly became apparent that not only was there a corpus of almost 1,000 freestanding books and periodicals, they existed, and they had even been digitized, and they were sitting there on the website of the National Yiddish Book Center, and it appeared that almost nobody was doing anything with them, particularly for an Anglophone audience. And I thought, somebody's got to start working with this material, especially as I read it, and I saw that, for every 9 terrible stories and poems that I read, there was a treasure, there was a gem, and somebody needed to do this. And I thought, maybe it could be me. And I also lucked out because in 2013, the Yiddish Book Center started a new project called the Translation Fellowship. They selected a group of early stage translators and taught us the craft of translation in a systematic way. And so I started working on this, and I very quickly realized that in order to have a conversation, people needed the primary texts, and I had to first get those out there in the form of honey on the page. But that if that conversation was going to have any traction, and if it was going to be a meaningful intervention in the study of modern Jewish history and culture, there also needed to be a critical interpretive study. And that's what I'm working on now. And I would go so far as to say that we really can't understand Jewish modernity, and particularly Ashkenazi modernity, without looking at some of these children's texts and what they are telling us about Jewish childhood, but also about Jewish adulthood and aspirations for a Jewish future. This is a very important part of the Jewish story. Now, you mentioned biographical information. There were 3 cases, all women, for whom the existing biographical record was either shoddy or non-existent. And I was able to put together a serviceable, skeletal biography of 2 of these female authors because they raised literary sons who both ended up writing memoirs that devoted at least a chapter to their mothers and their mothers' intellectual lives and projects. And in the 3rd case, a heroic librarian, Miriam Siegel, at the New York Public Library Dorot Division of Judaica, was able to help me track down the surviving son of Malka Sheikhet. And I approached him and asked him all about his mother's life, and he very generously shared the details so that I could also include a capsule biography of Malka Sheikhet in the book. And that was some of the most anxiety producing, but also most fun work that went into the volume.
So this relates to something that you've mentioned before, and we talked a little bit about at the beginning, and that's the interdisciplinary nature of some of this work, right? And I know, right, you come from comparative literature. I know that you're working with psychologists and psychology research at Emory to try and understand that. So I was wondering if you could speak about that process, what you've gained from that. And it's just a really interesting pairing that sort of seems obvious once you say it, but I hadn't thought to put them together before, right? What's it like reading Yiddish literature to psychology professors?
Thank you so much for flagging that, Dr. Weiss. That has been one of the most delightful aspects of working on this project, realizing that it abuts almost everything in the humanistic academy and also several disciplines within the social sciences. And I was very fortunate in the years 2015 through 2018 to be the recipient of an interdisciplinary faculty fellowship at Emory, where I was able to collaborate with the child psychologist Marshall Duke and with the anthropologist Melvin Connor. And we convened a faculty student seminar where we took these stories, as I translated them, as our primary texts, and we looked at them through the lens of child psychology and anthropology. And then Dr. Duke and I ended up creating a senior seminar and a freshman seminar about growing up Jewish and reading these texts once again as a psychologist would, so that we had the texts providing case studies in all kinds of issues, classic issues and issues at the forefront of studies about things like neurodivergence and consciousness and, how a theory of mind, how I come to understand that other people have thoughts and interiority and what kinds of thoughts and feelings I'm able to impute to them. So the project has been really enriched by all of that. And I'm reading a lot now about developmental psychology, trying to understand how changing views of what childhood is are reflected in some of the aesthetic choices and choices about representation that I'm seeing in these texts.
Thank you. Another question back to some of the more Jewish contexts is, especially with this story, but in general, these really struck me as sort of modern versions of Hasidic tales. And is that just because some of them are pastoral, right? They have a lot of elements of the country. Are there direct links, right? And whether it's in this Yiddish literature / Zionist literature, but in general, like how has Hasidut and these Hasidic stories influenced this genre?
So that's also a fantastic question. So one factor, as you mentioned, is the lyricism about the natural world, which is a really prominent feature of the Hasidic tale and also of this literature. The kind of preoccupation with nature and attention to nature that the founding modern Yiddish literary figure, Mendel Mendel the book peddler, had to fight for and write satirically about how Jews were alienated from nature, and this was a big problem. That is already assumed and baked into so much Yiddish literature by the 1920s. So some of it is just the development of the stance toward the natural world. But I think that another factor that's really similar is that both for Chassidim and for educators, there's a really keen sense that oral storytelling is essential to the audience and to the situation of sharing the story. Some of these stories were written for children to read independently at an age when their literacy development allowed for that. But it's very easy to imagine some of these stories having been told orally for pre-literate children or children whose literacy was emerging but wasn't yet equal to the level at which the story was pitched. And so both in the situation of the, let's say, Malava Malka, the long, Saturday night storytelling and singing and dancing opportunity, the Farbrengen, where Hasidim are sitting together with their leader and telling stories, and in a modern kindergarten or first grade classroom during circle time on the carpet, oral storytelling really comes to the fore. And I think that we see authors choosing to write for that kind of a story sharing habitus.
That's perfect. That was actually my last question, was if you know anything about how these stories were read or recited or how they were used. So that leads, that's perfectly. So we are unfortunately out of time. I want to thank you again so much. I want to encourage everyone to buy this beautiful, beautiful book. I see someone is already planning on buying some, so that is great. And I encourage the rest of you to join us the rest of the semester for all of our Schusterman programming. Thank you so much and have a lovely day.
Thank you so much, Dr. Weiss and Brandeis.